Chapter 1 Discovery. Dr. Richard Elman shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the Jeep bounced over the uneven dirt road. Dust plumed up in the rearview mirror, blending into the hazy orange of the setting sun. He had seen a lot in his career, but this was the first time he'd been summoned to a place like Greenfield, an out-of-the-way town where the most exciting thing to happen was the annual pie eating contest. "Dr. Elman?" The driver, a young man with a thick southern drawl, glanced over. "You ever been out this way before?" "No, I can't say I have," Richard replied, his eyes scanning the landscape. The fields were endless, dotted with the occasional farmhouse, even more run down than the last. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut hay, mingled with something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Not much out here except for farmland and stories," the driver said, giving a half smile. "Heard you hear about those weird creatures folks been seeing." Richard nodded, absently fingering the edge of his notebook. "That's right. I've been called in to investigate some unusual sightings. People are describing creatures that look like spiders or woodlice, but larger, and there's something about hay?" The driver chuckled, a sound rough and unamused. "You'll see. Ain't like anything you've ever seen before. Whole town's been talking about it. My cousin, she swears she saw one turn into a bale of hay right in front of her. Freaked her out good." "Turn into hay?" Richard's brow furrowed. He'd read the reports, but hearing it aloud was something else. "That doesn't make any sense. It's crazy." The driver finished for him. "Yeah, that's what everyone thought at first, but more people saw 'em. Couldn't be just one person going nuts." The Jeep came to a halt in front of a large, weathered barn. Its red paint had long faded, and the roof sagged as if weighed down by years of neglect. Richard stepped out, the ground crunching under his boots. He looked around, his senses alert. The air felt heavy, thick with the smell of hay and something else. Something faintly metallic. "This is the place," the driver said, climbing out and adjusting his cap. "I'll wait here if it's all the same to you." Richard nodded, barely hearing him. His focus was on the barn, on the faint scratching noise coming from within. It was a sound that reminded him of insects, the kind that scuttled in the dark corners of old buildings. He pulled out his flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the dim interior of the barn. Inside, the light flickered over the stacks of hay bales, neatly piled. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Just a dusty old barn with nothing out of the ordinary. But then, as his eyes adjusted, Richard noticed something. One of the bales, far at the back, seemed to be moving. He squinted, stepping closer. The scratching grew louder, more distinct. He hesitated, heart pounding. "Hello?" he called out, feeling foolish. What was he expecting? An answer? He took another step, the beam of his flashlight steady on the moving table. As he approached, the scratching stopped. The bale lay perfectly still. Richard's hand reached out, almost involuntarily, to touch the raw straw surface. The moment his fingers brushed the hay, it felt alive, warm. He jerked his hand back, a chill running down his spine. The hay smelled of earth and decay, like old secrets buried in the ground. "What the hell?" he muttered, taking a step back. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, what he was feeling. It wasn't possible. None of this was possible. And then it happened. The bale shifted, the straw rustling as if something beneath it was struggling to break free. Richard stumbled back, his flashlight beam wavering. The bale seemed to swell, its form twisting, the outline of legs, many legs, emerging from the straw. And just as quickly, it stopped. The bale settled back into its original shape, still and silent once more. Richard's breath came in short gasps. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. There is more to this than just hay and spiders. He needed to know what these creatures were, where they came from, and why they were here. As he turned to leave, a faint sound caught his ear. A soft, rhythmic clicking, almost like a whisper, echoing through the barn. Richard froze, the flashlight slipping from his fingers and clattering to the ground. This was just the beginning. Chapter 2. First Encounter. Richard stepped into the early morning light. The fields around him bathed in a soft golden glow. The air was still, almost unnaturally so, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He adjusted his backpack, making sure his camera and specimen jars were secure. Today he would find answers. The reports had led him here, to the old Thompson farm, where sightings had been most frequent. The barn loomed ahead, its faded red paints flaking off in the light. Richard's eyes swept the landscape, taking in every detail. The fields were quiet, the tall grass rustling softly in the breeze, but he felt a strange weight in the air, a tension that made his skin prickle. He moved towards the barn, his steps slow and deliberate, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath his boots. A chill ran down his spine. Through the morning was warm. There was a presence here, something he couldn't see but could almost feel, like a static charge in the air. Richard stopped just outside the barn door, his hand resting on the rough wood. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was no ordinary research trip. He had to be ready for anything. With a firm push, he opened the door. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through the slats of the weathered barn walls. The familiar scent of hay filled his nostrils, mingled with the musty odor of old wood and something else. Something that he couldn't quite place. It was a scent that made his stomach turn, metallic and sharp. His eyes scanned the interior, noting the piles of hay bales stacked neatly against the far wall. They looked ordinary, but Richard's experience the previous day had taught him better. He approached cautiously, his flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the shadows. As he moved closer, the silence grew heavier, pressing in around him. The hay bales lay still, but there was a tension in the air, a sense of something lurking just out of sight. Richard's heart pounded in his chest. He reached out, hand trembling, and touched the nearest bale. The moment his fingers brushed the straw, the bale shifted, a ripple through it. Richard stumbled back, his flashlight beam wavering. The hay seemed to move of its own accord, twisting and writhing, the faint outline of legs appearing briefly before it settled back into stillness. Richard's breath came in short gasps, his mind racing. He had seen it. He wasn't imagining things. There was something alive in there, something hiding beneath the guise of hay. He took a step closer, his fear tempered by a growing sense of curiosity. What were these creatures? How did they transform? He needed to understand. He crouched down, peering at the bale, his eyes searching for any sign of movement. The barn was silent, save for the faint rustling of straw. Richard leaned in, reaching out to pull at the hay to see what lay beneath. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, a sharp, clicking sound coming from the far corner of the barn. Richard froze, his head snapping up. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, like the tapping of many small legs on wood. It was the same sound he had heard the day before, the sound that had haunted his dreams. He turned the flashlight toward the noise, the beam illuminating the far end of the barn. His heart skipped a beat. There in the shadows, something moved. A shape, low to the ground, scuttling away from the light. Richard took a step forward, the beam steady, trying to get a better look. As the light caught the creature, it froze, its body tensing. It was nothing Richard had ever seen, a grotesque fusion of spider and woodlouse, its body covered in a rough, molted carapace. Its eyes glinted in the light, dark and unblinking. For a moment they stared at each other, man and creature, locked in a silent standoff. Then, without warning, the creature moved. It turned, its legs blurring into motion as it scurried away, disappearing into the shadows. Richard lunged forward, trying to catch it, but it was too fast. He stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the hay bale. The bale shifted under his weight, and Richard felt a moment of panic. He scrambled back, watching as the hay bale seemed to pulse, the shape beneath it moving, twisting, and then, as quickly as it began, it stopped. The bale lay still, the barn silent once more. Richard's hands shook, his mind a whirl of thoughts. He had seen them. They were real. He wasn't crazy, but what were they? Why were they here? As he stood in the dim light of the barn, surrounded by a silence, watching hay bales, a cold certainty settled over him. This was no ordinary phenomenon. There was something happening here, something far beyond his understanding. And whatever it was just beginning.
Chapter 3. Research begins. The small lab at Greenfield's local university was a far cry from the state-of-the-art facilities Richard was used to, but it would have to do. It was barely more than a converted classroom, with outdated equipment and peeling paint, but Richard had quickly made it his own. The table was covered in samples, smart jars filled with pieces of hay, slides ready for the microscope, and pages of scribbled notes. Richard sat at the center of this chaos, peering through the eyepiece of the microscope. He adjusted the focus, his brow furrowing as he studied the sample. He'd taken it from one of the hay bales in the Thompson barn, hoping to find some clue of the creature's nature. But so far, it had been nothing but ordinary hay. He leaned back, rubbing his eyes. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, filling the silence with their incessant hum. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the window, and Richard felt the weight of those shadows pressing in on him. He picked up his pen, jotting down his observations. Hay sample number 4. Composition typical of Festica apprentices. No anomalies detected. Structure consistent with standard agricultural hay. He dropped the pen with a sigh, staring at the notes in front of him. It didn't make any sense. He had seen the creatures with his own eyes, seen them transform. And yet, every test he ran showed the same thing. Ordinary hay. It was as if the creatures left no trace, no evidence of their existence. Richard stood up, pacing the length of the room. His colleagues had been polite, but he could see the doubt in their eyes. Hallucinations, they suggested. Stress. Maybe even a trick of the light. Richard knew what he had seen. He wasn't crazy. He stopped at the window, looking out over the quiet campus. Students passed by in small groups, laughing and talking, oblivious to the strange events unfolding just beyond the town limits. Richard watched them for a moment, a pang of envy tightening in his chest. They didn't know the darkness lurking in the fields, the hidden danger waiting to strike. A knock at the door broke his reverie. Richard turned to see a young woman, one of the university's research assistants, standing hesitantly in the doorway. "Dr. Elman," she said, "Professor Kane asked me to check in on you, see if you needed anything." Richard managed a smile, though it felt forced. "Thank you, Jenna. I'm fine, just a little stuck." He gestured to the table, to the rows of jars and notes. "These samples, they aren't showing me anything new. I'm beginning to wonder if I'm wasting my time." Jenna stepped inside, her eyes curious as she looked over the jars. "These from the hay bales people have been talking about. The ones that change?" Richard nodded. "Yes, but so far there's nothing unusual. No chemical differences, no signs of foreign organisms. Just hay." Jenna picked up one of the jars, turning it in her hands. "What if the transformation isn't physical? What if it's, I don't know, something else?" Richard frowned, considering. "You mean like a projection? An illusion?" "Maybe." Jenna set the jar down carefully. "Or maybe it's something we don't have the tools to detect. Something beyond our current understanding." Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. The idea had occurred to him, but he hadn't wanted to believe it. If these creatures were operating on a level he couldn't comprehend, how could he ever hope to understand them? "I've been looking through the university's archives," Jenna continued. "There are some old records from decades ago that mention strange sightings in the area. Creatures, transformations. I thought you might want to see them." Richard's interest piqued. You found records. From when? About 50 years ago, Jenna said. There was a similar incident. People reported seeing strange creatures, but no one can ever prove anything. The records are vague, but it sounds a lot like what you've been describing. Richard felt a surge of excitement mixed with a flicker of fear. If there had been previous sightings, then this wasn't a one-time phenomenon. These creatures had been here before, and if they were back now, it meant they had a reason. Thank you, Jenna, he said, his mind racing. I'd like to see those records. Anything that might help me understand what's happening here. Jenna nodded, and Richard watched her leave, his thoughts a whirl of possibilities. If these creatures had been here before, then someone might have studied them, might have found a way to fight them. He had to find out more. He turned back to his notes. Richard couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The creatures were here for a reason, and whatever this reason was, it couldn't be good. The sense of unease that had been growing in him since he arrived in Greenfield was now a cold certainty. This was no ordinary research project. He was on the brink of discovering something that could change everything. Something that could turn the world he knew into something dark and unrecognizable. Richard picked up his pen, the nib scratching against the paper as he wrote. The lines were jagged, the ink bleeding into the page. What if this was just the beginning? He wrote, the words stark against the white of the paper. He stared at them, the truth of it settling deep in his bones. He had come here looking for answers, but all he found were more questions, more mysteries. And somewhere, out in the fields, the creatures were waiting.
Chapter 4. Increasing Encounters. Richard stood at the edge of the field, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows over the landscape. The once peaceful town of Greenfield had changed. There was an unease in the air, a palpable tension that seemed to hang over everything. The townspeople whispered to each other, their voices low, their eyes constantly shifting to the fields, as if expecting to see something move in the tall grass. He pulled out his notebook, flipping through the pages. His notes were scattered, filled with hastily scribbled observations and half-formed theories. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. These creatures were appearing more frequently. The reports had doubled in the past week alone, each sighting eerier than the last. It wasn't just in the barns anymore. The creatures were showing up in open fields, near the edge of town, even close to people's homes. They were becoming bolder, more aggressive, as if they were no longer content to hide in the shadows. Richard could feel it in his bones. Something was drawing them out. He glanced back at the farmhouse, its windows dark, the silhouette of a person visible against the flickering candlelight. The Thompsons had left the town 2 days ago, driven out by fear. They weren't the only ones. Richard had seen the trucks, the hurried packing, the silent departures. Greenfield was emptying, people fleeing from the unknown threat. Richard's jaw tightened. He had to find out why. Why now? Why here? There had to be a reason, a pattern, something he could use to understand what was happening. He turned back to the field, his flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. The grass rustled softly in the wind, the only sound in the stillness. Richard stepped forward, his feet crunching on the dry earth. He scanned the ground, looking for any sign, any clue. And then he saw it. A bale of hay, half hidden in the grass. It was out of place, sitting alone in the middle of the field. Richard's heart beat faster. He approached cautiously, the beam of his flashlight steady. The bale lay still, but Richard knew better than to trust appearances. He crouched down, his hand hovering over the rough straw. His fingers brushed against it, and, for a moment, nothing happened. Then the hay shifted, a faint rustling sound filling the air. Richard pulled his hand back, his eyes wide. The bale pulsed, the outline of something moving beneath the straw. Richard took a step back, his mind racing. The creatures were here. He could feel it. They were watching him, waiting. But why? What were they after? The wind picked up, rustling the grass around him, and Richard felt a chill run down his spine. He turned, scanning the field. The shadows seemed to stretch, to twist into shapes that weren't there before. The air was thick with a sense of something lurking, just out of sight. Richard's flashlight flickered, and for a moment, he thought he saw something. Of movement. A glint of eyes in the dark. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The shadows seemed to shift, to move closer, and then was gone. The light steadied, and the field was empty once more. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, the silence pressing in on him. He knew he wasn't alone. The creatures were out there, hiding, watching. They were closer than ever. He turned back to the hay bale, his mind racing. There had to be a way to understand them, to find out what they wanted. He couldn't let fear cloud his judgment. He had to stay focused, to think. Richard pulled out his notebook, flipping to a blank page. He jotted down the time, the location, the appearance of the bale. He needed to record everything to find the pattern, the key to understanding. As he wrote, a thought occurred to him. The sightings were increasing, yes, but they were also following a path, a line that traced the edges of the town, the outskirts. It was almost as if the creatures were circling, closing in. Richard's pen paused, hovering over the page. What if they were? What if the creatures were being drawn to something at the center of the circle? He flipped back through his notes, tracing the pattern, the locations of the sightings. It formed a rough perimeter, a boundary around the town. His pulse quickened. If he could find what was at the center, maybe he could find the answer. Maybe he could stop them. Richard snapped his notebook shut, his mind made up. He had to find the center. He had to know what was drawing these creatures, what was pulling them from the shadows. He turned back to the field, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The hay bale lay still, silent, as if waiting. Richard stepped forward, his jaw set, determination burning in his eyes. This wasn't just about the creatures anymore. It was about the town and the people who lived here. Richard couldn't shake the feeling that they were all in danger, that something terrible was coming. As he walked back to the farmhouse, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint, rhythmic clicking he had come to dread. Richard quickened his pace, the sound following him, haunting him. He had to find the answer before it was too late. Chapter 5. The Transformation. Richard stood in the center of the field, his eyes locked on the bale of hay in front of him. The night was dark, the moon hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, casting the world into a shadow. His breath came in shallow gasps, the cold air burning in his lungs. He hadn't expected to find one so close to town. His flashlight beam flickered, cutting through the darkness to illuminate the bale. It looked ordinary enough, just a mass of straw, bound together with rough twine. But Richard knew better. He had seen them move, seen the way the hay seemed to pulse with a life of its own. He stepped closer, the grass crunching under his boots. There was a silence, a stillness that settled over the field, pressing in on him. The only sound was a faint rustle of straw, a sound that set his nerves on edge. Richard held his breath, his hand reaching out towards the bale. His fingers brushed the surface. The transformation began. It was subtle at first, a shiver running through the hay, a ripple that spread like a wave. Richard stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. The bale twisted, the straw shifting, moving as if it had a mind of its own. He watched, mesmerized, as the hay seemed to unravel, revealing something dark and slick beneath. A leg, thin, jointed, and black as night, emerged from the mass of straw, followed by another and another. Bales seemed to shrink, the hay falling away to reveal a creature crouched at its center. Richard's stomach turned. The creature was like nothing he'd ever seen, a grotesque fusion of a spider and a woodlouse, its body covered in a rough, molted copperas. Its legs were long, too long, stretching out from its body like twisted strands of wire. Dark, glassy eyes stared at him, unblinking, reflecting the beam of his flashlight. He took another step back, his foot catching on a clump of grass. He stumbled, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and hitting the ground with a dull thud. The beam wavered, casting shadows that twisted and danced. The creature didn't move, its eyes locked on Richard, its body tense, as if waiting. The air was thick with a sense of impending danger, a feeling that Richard couldn't shake. This wasn't just a transformation. It was a hunt. The creature was waiting, watching, sizing him up. A chill ran down his spine, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. The hay bales weren't a defense. They were a trap. Richard's breath came out in ragged gasps, his mind racing. He had to get away, to warn the others. These creatures were predators, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. He turned, his eyes scanning the field, looking for a way out. And then he saw them. More bales scattered across the field, each one beginning to move, to shift, as if waking from a long slumber. The rustling of straw filled the air, a sound that sent a bolt of fear through him. They were everywhere, all around him. Panic surged in his chest, his hands shaking. He had to get away, had to find help. Richard stumbled forward, his feet pounding against the earth, the sound of rustling hay following him, chasing him. The shadows seemed to stretch, to reach out, clawing at him, trying to pull him back. He ran, his heart pounding in his ears, the cold air stinging his lungs. The field stretched out before him, endless, the darkness pressing in on all sides. Richard didn't look back, didn't dare. He could feel the creatures behind him, feel their eyes watching, the legs moving, closing the distance. The farmhouse loomed ahead, its windows dark, the door hanging open. Richard barreled through, slamming the door shut behind him, his hands fumbling for the lock. He leaned against the door, his chest heaving, his mind a whirl of fear and adrenaline. The silence was deafening. The only sound, his ragged breathing. He strained his ears, listening for the rustling of straw, the click of legs against wood. The darkness seemed to pulse, to press in around him, suffocating. Richard sank to the floor, his back against the door, his hands shaking. He had to think, had to understand. These creatures weren't just hiding. They were hunting. And now that they had shown themselves, there was no telling what they could do. He reached for his notebook, his fingers numb. He had to write it down, had to record what he had seen. The words came out shaky, the pen scratching against the paper. Creatures are predatory. Hay bales use as camouflage, not defense, but trap. He stopped, the pen hovering over the page. What do they want? Why now? Why here? His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information, to find a pattern, a reason. Richard's eyes drifted to the window, the darkness outside pressing against the glass. The sense of unease, of something lurking just beyond his sight, filled him. He knew he was close to understanding, to finding the answer. But the truth, whatever it was terrifying. He closed the notebook, his hands still trembling. He had to be ready. The creatures were out there, waiting. And whatever they were planning, Richard had a feeling it was just beginning. The house was silent, the darkness thick. Richard's eyes never left the window, his mind on high alert. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something he couldn't stop. And somewhere in the field, the rustling of hay continued, a sound that echoed through the night, a reminder of the danger lurking in the shadows. Chapter 6. Revelation. Richard's hands trembled as he spread the old documents across the table in his makeshift lab. The yellowed pages, brittle with age, crackled under his touch. Jen had brought him the files late last night, eyes wide with the urgency of her discovery. They spent hours poring over them, reading by the dim light of a single bulb, the night stretching on as they uncovered the truth, buried in the past. The records were fragmented, notes scribbled in haste as if the author had been in a rush to get everything down. They spoke of sightings, strange phenomena in the fields surrounding Greenfield, of creatures that moved like shadows, hiding in plain sight. But it was the oldest record, a faded journal entry from over a century ago that made Richard's blood run cold. "They are not of this world," the entry read, the ink smeared as if the writer's hand had trembled. "I've seen them, the creatures that come in the night. They hide in the hay. They are ancient, older than we can imagine. They have been here before. They will be here long after we are gone." Richard leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. It wasn't just the words that chilled him, but the sense of history they carried, a sense that these creatures had always been here, waiting. He glanced at Jenna, her face pale in the dim light. "They've been here before," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "These creatures, they are not new. This has been happening for decades, maybe centuries. Every so often they appear, and then they vanish, leaving no trace, and now they're back." Jenna nodded, her eyes with understanding. "It's like they're waiting for something. A signal or a cycle. Something that draws them out of hiding." Richard stared at the journal, the ancient ink blurred and faded. The thought of those creatures, these alien things, lurking in the shadows for centuries, sent a shiver down his spine. They weren't just random predators. They had a purpose, a reason for being here. He turned to another page, the faded sketches of the creatures filling the margins. They were detailed, too detailed. The drawings capturing the grotesque fusion of spider and woodlouse, the dark, glassy eyes that seemed to follow him, even from the page. Richard felt a chill run down through him. The artist had seen them, just as he had. His eyes moved to the bottom of the page, to a line scrawled in hurried, frantic letters. "They are searching for something," it read. "Something buried, something lost. They will not stop until they find it." Richard's hand tightened around the edge of the table. "What are they looking for?" he muttered, his mind racing. "What could they possibly want?" Jenna's voice was soft, almost hesitant. "What if it's not something physical? What if it's knowledge, information? Maybe they're looking for something that's been lost to time, something only they can understand?" Richard considered her words, the idea settling uneasily in his mind. He had always thought of these creatures as animals, driven by instinct. But what if they were more? What if they were intelligent, sentient, with a purpose far beyond his understanding? He stood, pacing the small room, the old floorboards creaking under his weight. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, but the picture they formed was terrifying. These creatures were ancient, alien, with a knowledge and purpose that stretched beyond human comprehension. Richard stopped, staring at the journal on the table, the words seeming to pulse in the dim light. "They are not of this world." The truth of it settled in his bones, a weight that he couldn't shake. These creatures weren't just a threat to Greenfield. They were a threat to everything. He turned to Jenna, his eyes dark with determination. "We need to find out what they're coming from, what's drawing them out. If we can understand that, maybe we can stop them." Jenna nodded, the fear in her eyes replaced by a steely resolve. "I've been looking at the old maps," she said, pulling a folded paper from her pocket. She spread it out on the table, the edges worn and frayed. "There's a place just outside of town. It's marked as an old archaeological site, but there's no record of excavation. It's like it was forgotten." Richard's heart pounded. "Do you think that's where they're coming from?" "It's possible," Jenna said. "The sightings seem to circle around that area. It could be the center of what's happening." Richard felt a surge of hope, mingled with fear. If they could find the source, maybe they could find a way to stop the creatures, to end this before it's too late. He nodded, his jaw set. "We go there. We need to go there. Tonight. We need to see it for ourselves." Jenna's eyes were steady. "I'll get the equipment," she said, turning to leave. Richard watched her go, the silence of the room settling around him. He turned back to the journal, his fingers tracing the faded ink. These creatures were more than just animals. They were survivors, relics of a time long past with a purpose that stretched beyond human understanding. Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something vast and ancient, something that had been waiting, just out of sight. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as if echoing the thoughts in his mind. Richard closed the journal, the sense of unease thick in the air. They had to find the source, to understand what these creatures were searching for. And he had a feeling that whatever it was It was something that should have stayed buried. Chapter 7. The Threat Unveiled. The wind howled through the trees as Richard and Jenna made their way through the darkened field. The flashlights cut through the night, beams of light piercing the shadows that seemed to stretch and twist around them. The ground was uneven, roots and rocks jutting out, but they pushed on, driven by a sense of urgency that had gripped them both since they left the lab. The old archaeological site was just ahead, a small clearing surrounded by a circle of ancient oaks. Richard could see the remains of old equipment, rusted and broken, scattered across the ground. A makeshift fence surrounded the area, its wood rotting, the paint peeling away in long strips.
"This is it,"
Jenna said, her voice barely above a whisper in the wind.
"This is where it all started."
Richard nodded, his eyes scanning the darkness. He could feel the presence of the creatures, the weights of their eyes on him, watching from the shadows. His heart pounded in his chest, a steady drumbeat of fear. They were close. He could sense it. They moved forward, stepping over the fallen fence into the heart of the clearing. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, of decay. Richard's flashlight swept over the ground, revealing the remnants of old digging equipment, the bones of long-dead animals, half buried in the soil. He crouched down, examining the remains. "These animals," he said, his voice low. "They've been torn apart. Eaten." Jenna knelt beside him, her face pale in the dim light.
"The creatures," she said. "They're feeding, preparing for something."
Richard's stomach turned. He had seen the creatures hunt, seen the way they moved, silent and swift like shadows. They weren't just hiding anymore. They were hungry, desperate. Now they were hunting. A sound broke through the night, a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down Richard's spine. He stood, his flashlight sweeping the clearing. The shadows seemed to move, to pulse with life. And then he saw them. The creatures emerged from the darkness, their bodies low to the ground, legs moving in a strange, rhythmic motion. Their eyes glinted in the light, dark and empty. Richard's breath caught in his throat. There were so many of them, more than he had ever seen, their forms a mass of twisted limbs and chitinous bodies.
"They're everywhere,"
Jenna whispered, her voice trembling.
"What do we do?"
Richard's mind raced. They were surrounded, trapped in the clearing. The creatures moved closer, their bodies rustling against the ground, a sound like dry leaves in the wind. He could see the hunger in their eyes, the cold, calculating gaze of a predator. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice tight. "Now." They turned to run, but the creatures were faster. Richard felt a sharp pain in his leg, and he stumbled, hitting the ground hard. His flashlight rolled away, casting its beam across the clearing. He looked down, his breath catching in his throat. One of the creatures had latched onto his leg, its jaws digging into his flesh. "Richard!" Jenna screamed, rushing to his side. She grabbed a rock, slamming it down on the creature's head. It hissed, its legs twitching, and then it went still. Richard gasped, pulling his leg free, blood soaking into the ground. The other creatures moved closer, their bodies shifting, the hay falling away to reveal the dark, glistening forms beneath. Richard pushed himself up, his leg burning with pain. They had to move. They had to get out. He grabbed Jenna's arm, pulling her towards the edge of the clearing. The creatures followed, their movement swift, relentless. Richard's heart pounded, fear driving him forward. They had to reach the trees, to find cover, to escape. The edge of the clearing was just ahead, the trees looming like shadows. Richard pushed on, Jenna at his side, the creatures close behind. The air was thick with the sound of their movements, the rustle of hay, the click of legs against the ground. They burst through the tree line, branches tearing at their clothes, the darkness swallowing them. Richard's lungs burned, his legs throbbing with pain, but he kept moving. He could hear Jenna beside him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, the creatures snarled, their voices a low, guttural chorus that echoed through the forest. Richard's heart raced, They were close. Too close. He could feel them, sense their hunger, their need. They wouldn't stop. They wouldn't give up. They stumbled into the clearing, the moonlight casting a pale glow over the ground. Richard turned, his eyes searching the shadows. The creatures were there, just beyond the edge of the light, their eyes glinting in the dark. He could feel their presence, the weight of their gaze.
"We can't keep running," Jenna said, her voice shaking. "They're too fast. Too many."
Richard's mind raced, searching for a solution, for a way out. His eyes fell on a fallen branch. Its wood splintered sharp. He grabbed it, holding it out like a weapon. Jenna followed his lead, picking up a rock, her hands trembling. The creatures moved closer, their bodies low, legs moving in a strange, hypnotic rhythm. Richard's heart pounded, his grip tightening on the branch. They had to fight. They had no choice. The first creature lunged, its jaws snapping. Richard swung the branch, the wood connecting with a sickening crunch. The creature fell back, hissing, its legs twitching. Another followed, and another. Jenna swung her rock, her face set in grim determination. The air was thick with the sound of battle, the cries of the creatures, the thud of wood and stone against chitin. Richard's arms burned, his body aching, but he kept fighting, kept swinging. They had to survive. They had to. The creatures fell back, their bodies twitching, the ground littered with their broken forms. Richard stood, breathing hard, the branch heavy in his hands. The forest was silent, the air thick with the sound of blood and decay. Jenna dropped the rock, her hand shaking.
What do we do now?"
Richard looked around, his eyes scanning the darkness. They had survived, but the creatures would be back. They had to find a way to stop them, to end this. "We go back to the lab," his voice said, steady. "We find a way to fight them. To kill them." Jenna nodded, her eyes dark with resolve.
"We have to warn the others, the town. They need to know what's coming."
Richard turned, his eyes on the path ahead. The night stretched out before them, dark and silent. The creatures were out there, waiting, watching. Richard could feel it, a sense of dread settling in his chest. This was just the beginning. The real fight was yet to come. Chapter 8. Confrontation and Resolution. The cold wind howled through the shattered remains of the old barn, carrying with it the scent of decay and something far older. Richard stood at the center of the barn, his makeshift weapon clutched tightly in his hand. The sound of scuttling echoed from the shadows, the creature's dark forms barely visible against the gloom. The barn was filled with the remnants of the struggle. Broken tools, overturned bales of hay, and splintered wood. The creatures had been relentless, the numbers growing with each passing hour, drawn by some invisible call. Richard could feel their presence, a weight pressing down on him like the air before a storm. Jenna stood beside him, her face pale, but her eyes filled with a steely determination. They had been preparing for this moment, studying the creatures, finding their weaknesses. They discovered that the creatures reacted to certain frequencies, sounds that seemed to disrupt their senses and drive them back. Richard adjusted the small device in his hand, a portable speaker rigged to emit the high-frequency sound they had discovered. It was their last hope, the only chance to turn the tide. He glanced at Jenna, her expression mirroring his own resolve. There was no turning back now. "Ready?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. Jenna nodded, gripping her own device. "Let's do this." Richard took a breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He pressed the button, and the sound erupted from the speakers, a high-pitched whine that filled the barn, vibrating through the walls. The effect was immediate. The creatures recoiled, their bodies twitching, their legs thrashing against the ground. They screamed, a sound like metal tearing, a cry that echoed through the night. Richard felt a surge of hope, watching as the creatures writhed in pain, their bodies convulsing. The sound was driving them back, breaking their coordination, their rhythm. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on the nearest creature. It was larger than the others, its carapace glistening with a dark, oily sheen. It reared up, its jaws snapping, but the sound seemed to hold it back, to weaken it. Richard swung his makeshift weapon, the wood connecting with a sickening crunch. The creature fell, its legs twitching, its body shuddering. Richard didn't stop, didn't hesitate. He swung again and again until the creature lay still, its eyes dark, staring blankly into the night. Jenna was just beside him, her own device blaring, driving the creatures back. They moved as one, striking, swinging, pushing the creatures toward the barn doors, towards the open air. The creatures screamed, their voices blending with a high-pitched whine, a cacophony of sound that filled Richard's ears. He could feel the tide turning, the creatures falling back, their movements disjointed, desperate. They were winning. Richard felt a surge of adrenaline, a fierce primal joy. They were going to survive. The last of the creatures stumbled through the barn doors, their bodies twisting, legs flailing. Richard followed, his weapon ready, his heart racing. The night was alive with sound, the wind howling, the creatures screaming, the high-pitched whine cutting through it all. And then suddenly, it was over. The creatures lay in the dirt, their bodies broken still. The wind died, the sound fading, leaving a silence that was almost deafening. Richard stood in the doorway, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body trembling with exhaustion. Jenna was beside him, her face pale, her eyes wide. They had done it. They had won. The creatures were gone, defeated. Richard felt a wave of relief, of triumph. They had survived. He dropped his weapon, his hand shaking. The night was still, the darkness pressing in around them. Richard felt the weight of it, the silence, the absence of the creatures. It was over. They had won. But as he stood there, staring at the fallen creatures, Richard felt a chill run down his spine. The sense of unease, the feeling that something was wrong, didn't leave him. He glanced at Jenna, her eyes mirroring her own fear. "They're gone," she said, her voice quiet. "We did it." Richard nodded, but the words felt hollow, empty. He looked out into the night, the darkness stretching on, endless. The creatures were gone, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, lingered. "Is it really over?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jenna didn't answer, her eyes scanning the shadows, the darkness that seemed to pulse with life. Richard felt the weight of it, the sense of something lurking just out of sight. He couldn't shake the feeling that they'd only won a battle, but not the war. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, the sound like a whisper of 1,000 voices. Richard shivered, his eyes fixed on the horizon, the dark line of the forest. He knew deep down that the creatures were gone, but he also knew that something else was out there. Something that had been waiting, watching. He turned to Jenna, his expression grim. "We need to warn the others, the town. They need to know." Jenna nodded, her eyes dark with understanding. "We'll tell them," she said. "Richard, what if they come back?" Richard looked out into the night, the shadow stretching on, endless. The creatures were gone, but the sense of danger, of threat lingered. He knew they had won a victory, but the war was far from over. "We'll be ready." His voice steady, his eyes hard. "Next time, we'll be ready." They turned, walking back towards the town, the darkness closing in behind them. The barn stood silent, the wind whispering through the broken windows, a reminder of the battle that had been fought, the danger that still lurked. As they walked, Richard felt the weight of the night, the sense of something watching, waiting. He knew deep down that they had only scratched the surface, that the real threat was still out there, waiting in the shadows. The night was dark, the wind cold, the sense of unease thick in the air. Richard glanced at Jenna, her face set, her eyes focused. They had survived, but the fight was far from over. The creatures were gone, but a sense of danger, of threat remained. Richard knew that they had won a battle, but the war was just beginning. And somewhere, out in the darkness, the creatures were waiting. Thank you again, Tom, for allowing me to bring your story to life with my voice. And hope all you listening enjoyed.